So we're now recording.
So we are now recording. Hi everyone. My name is Anamik Saha and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Media Communication and Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths, and I'm the chair for this panel that is called Liberalism's Others. So thank you so much for joining us, especially on a day as beautiful as this one, or for those of you in London, of course. We have three presentations in this session. I'll introduce each of the speakers before their presentation. The format will be, we will have all the three presentations, one after the other, each one lasting no more than 15 minutes, and then that should give us enough time for a Q&A at the end. If you have a question, please leave it in the chat box and we'll try to address it in the Q&A. In the Q&A itself, you can also, if you wanted to, put your hand up and ask your question. I was going to say in person, you know what I mean, live, out loud, though you need to put your hand up in order to do that so we can unmute you, because at the moment you're muted. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. We have Michael Wayne. Michael Wayne is a professor of film and media at Brunel University. He writes widely on film, media, politics, class, and Marxist cultural theory. His most recent monographs are Marxism Goes to the Movies and England's Discontents, Political Cultures and National Identities. He has co-directed several documentary feature films, including with Deirdre O'Neill, The Acting Class. So the title of Michael's paper is The Guardian and Brexit. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Anamik, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. Oh, sorry, just letting the dog in. Okay, so I've done a little concept map here that we're going to sort of work our way around clockwise. And I'm going to read from my paper, otherwise I'm not going to get through in the allotted time. So how do we understand The Guardian and its limits? We can take a political economy perspective, and that will give us some of the broad parameters within which it works and the material basis for its liberalism. But in order to understand that liberalism in its historical specificity, we need a political analysis as well. And then what kind of political analysis? Well, we need to understand how liberalism works in relation to the other political cultures that are out there, in particular how it relates to its long-term partner and competitor, conservatism. We also need to understand the relationship between the political cultures that rule, that's liberalism and conservatism, and the way capitalism, which they defend to the death, systematically negates their own moral political universes. And in times of crisis, that can drive a wedge between the partner competitors. The tension between capitalism's national and international logics, which I don't unfortunately have time to go into, is particularly pertinent to the subject of Brexit. We also need to understand the relationship between the dominant coalition up here and the dominated classes. So my political model then is an elaboration of Gramsci's concept of the historic bloc. The bloc indicates that relatively long-term stable settlements of an intra and interclass nature, the intra ones are up here, the interclass is down here with the dominated classes, have been forged. It's the task of politics to organise those settlements. They don't come about naturally. The organising of those settlements requires a battle for hearts and minds. It requires the struggle for political and moral leadership. The winning of that struggle establishes what Gramsci called hegemony, securing the historic bloc on a more or less consensus basis, which minimises, although never eliminates, the requirement to use force to keep the dominated classes on board. But there are these contradictions, relations involving self-negating dynamics. In recent times, we've seen the settlements between the dominant classes and the political traditions which orchestrate those settlements fracture. The historic bloc of conservatism and liberalism have fallen out big time over the UK's membership of the EU. A strand of conservatism has seen the resurgence of a Thatcherism redux, a return of that peculiar combination of aggressive imperial-tinged nationalism, slavish deference to American foreign policy and commercial culture, and championing of international capitalism, especially outside Europe. Liberalism, by contrast, remains committed to a different model of capitalism with a different political cultural configuration, involving the pooling of sovereignty, multilateral and supranational governance, weak democratic accountability, but coated with a thin sheen of cosmopolitan tolerance and fuzzy inclusivity. One of liberalism's others, then, is that branch of conservatism that has sheared away from liberalism, what liberalism would call sensible, moderate, mainstream conservatism, and become, again, what liberalism would call a populism of the right, whose signature policy, leaving the EU, marked a breach in the dominant class consensus. The other for liberalism has been what it would define as a left-wing populism. And here, the rise of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party was the key antagonist who needed to be defeated just as much, possibly more, than the populist right needed to be defeated. Within this context, the Guardian functions as the intellectual high command, a phrase that I get from Gramsci, who was talking about how major newspapers could function to influence politics and parties. The Guardian is the intellectual high command of liberalism, and it has close contacts with the Parliamentary Labour Party, the bulk of which opposed Corbyn's leadership. Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party was viewed as a freak accident, an anomaly, an inexplicable spasm by the membership who voted for him twice. Let's remember that Corbyn represented only a very modest return to social democracy. Even this was too much for the Guardian and liberalism generally. Now, in his contribution to the collection Capitalism's Conscience, Gary Young says that he thought the role of the Guardian in Corbyn's downfall was not that significant. Actually, he says that it was not decisive. Well, decisive is a strong word, and it raises the bar quite high, I think, in terms of when we should start being alarmed about its role. I think it was very influential as an amplifier of strategies being designed elsewhere, primarily within the PLP. It was influential directly on the Labour Party, its members, and more broadly voters and supporters who read the paper. And that in turn was consequential more widely. The Guardian helped prise the membership away from Corbyn politically, psychologically, in terms of where their energies and efforts went, who or what they saw as their priorities, and who or what they saw as their enemies. The Guardian helped orchestrate passions conducive to the status quo. Now, we are in a situation pregnant with possibility and change for both good or bad, a conjuncture, as Gramsci would call it, when the contradictions mature. Initially, a chasm had opened up between the membership and the bulk of the PLP over the election of Jeremy Corbyn. This chasm represented a partial breach with economic neoliberalism by the membership. But that chasm was closed up again. The gulf between the membership and the PLP was healed, and it was healed on the terms that most suited the PLP. The membership were enticed back onto the terrain of economic neoliberalism by liberalism's hegemony over the question of Britain's membership of the EU. The Guardian could be persuasive and efficacious here because they were tapping into existing soft left pro-EU sentiment within the membership and wider sections of Labour voters. They didn't invent that sentiment, but they could and did help lead it, shore it up, give it intellectual ammunition and moral fervour. At the 2018 Labour Party conference, the leadership was flooded with 150 motions from constituency parties on Brexit, 84 of which called for a people's vote. YouGov reported that 86% of Labour's members wanted a second referendum. Those members overwhelmingly read The Guardian. The Guardian is overwhelmingly read by people who vote Labour, but primarily middle-class people who vote Labour. The skew between the middle-class demographics of the Labour membership, around 77% of the membership falling into ABC1 categories, and the Guardian readership, around 85% of readers falling into ABC1 class classifications, map nicely over each other. Only slightly lower levels of support for a second vote could be found in the trade unions, which demonstrates the hegemony of liberalism across an increasingly white-collar public services labour movement. So a class cultural fissure was opened up between, on the one hand, Labour's membership, the labour movement, the electoral base in the big cities, and on the other, the northern towns. Most of the latter had voted overwhelmingly to leave the EU. In 2017, Labour had gone into the election promising to respect that vote. As a result, May's plan, which was to convert the Northern vote for Brexit into a vote for the Tories, stalled. She lost the majority bequeathed to her by Cameron. Corbyn was almost vindicated, the PLP sullen. But the cunning of history had given them a card to play. Without her majority, Brexit could be frustrated with parliamentary gains. Corbyn could be dragged kicking and screaming into a policy of giving a second vote. At the same time, he could be mercilessly attacked because he was reluctant to do so. This in turn could fracture Corbyn's fragile alliance. Guardian writers like Polly Toynbee, who reeks of class condescension, could not wait to get rid of small c Conservative Labour voters in the small northern towns. Perhaps in her mind, she genuinely believed that an electoral majority of middle-class Liberal progressives could be fashioned around a Remain campaign. Probably smarter people within The Guardian realised that to kill the Corbyn project, Corbyn had to lose the forthcoming general election by fracturing the class alliance that had put Corbyn within touching distance of victory in 2017. For the chapter I wrote in Capitalism's Conscience, I looked at a sample of pieces between July 2017 and just before the election, November 2019. I chose 29 articles, one for each month, written by 21 different writers, Guardian staff writers and some guest writers that were invited. 3 key frames emerged from the sample. And I'm sure, as you know, frames are a way of interpreting and shaping reality, identifying problems and solutions, who are the heroes, who are the villains, how to evaluate things. A frame can be very revealing. It often tells us less about the reality the frame is slapped over than the assumptions underpinning the frame. So what were the 3 frames that I discovered? Well, the first frame was Brexit as existential crisis. Above all, leaving the EU on any terms imaginable was the liberal equivalent to conservatism losing the empire. It was Britain sinking beneath the waves, a disaster of unmitigated proportion. Nothing else mattered as much as reversing this appalling scenario, not even the democratic vote that had legitimated it. Brexit was totemic. All the values of pragmatic, liberal, rational, moderate politics were represented in the EU and in staying in the EU. Brexit as existential crisis raised the levels of hysteria and diminished the room for compromise. Crucially, it continued the binary yes-no of the referendum in what should have been the space of political compromise. But no, liberalism can be quite irrationally intransigent when it wants to be. It heroically took upon itself to save the dim-witted fools who had voted for an act of what it called national self-harm. It had never got so upset about the trashing of the political economy of social democracy in the last 40 years, but now it was furious. And Corbyn's Euroscepticism was well known. Wasn't he even personally responsible for the success of the Leave vote? Of course he was, and he secretly wanted it to happen. I'm summarising, albeit with a sardonic slant, the prevalent tropes. Frame number 2, Corbyn the incompetent. So certain were the cheerleaders of Remain that it was obvious that Labour should swing behind a second vote and campaign for staying in the EU that many commentators concluded that Corbyn was incompetent. He kept missing an open goal of supporting Remain. For Simon Jenkins, Corbyn was a man with a, quote, meagre reserve of parliamentary talent. End quote. His reluctance to be dragged along in the slipstream of the Remain campaign was interpreted as indecisiveness. He was not a leader because he had spent 30 years on the back benches. He was passive, an absence where agency should be. Brexit politics, Martin Kettle wrote, has happened around him, not with him or through him. Ad hominem attacks on Corbyn's professionalism, intellect and leadership capacity grew to intensely vitriolic passion in The Guardian's readership base. Linda D66, for example, opined below the line, quote, Corbyn is without doubt one of the stupidest MPs we have, end quote. Such personal attacks bracketed off the political problems of trying to hold together that increasingly fragile electoral coalition that made up Labour's vote. Few people in The Guardian thought that a, quote, stupid fetishisation of the EU might be the problem. 3, an illegitimate left. Corbyn was assailed by liberalism as a representative of an illegitimate left well outside the traditions of parliamentary democracy, and was even a danger to parliamentary democracy, even though Corbyn had spent most of his professional life as a constituency MP. There was an extraordinary recycling of Cold War themes in this discourse. For Martin Kettle, Labour is being, quote, radically transformed into a party in the leader's own far left image, end quote, which, if it had been true, would have solved many of Corbyn's problems. For Raphael Baer, extremism on the right and left of the political spectrum was tugging at the seam of sensible centrist politics. When some of Corbyn's senior supporters tried to oust Tom Watson from the post of deputy leader, as he had been undermining the leadership since 2015, Andrew Rawnsley in The Observer juggled images of, quote, Stalin's henchmen and, quote, the Soviet dictator with mafioso gangsterism. He talked of capos and drive-by shootings, etc. For Will Hutton, Labour's, quote, leadership is too indiscriminately critical of all business and wedded to the socialist transformation of capitalism. Not even the Chinese and Cuban communist parties believe that, he wrote. This idea that Corbyn represents an illegitimate political tradition, one with its roots way outside British constitutionalism, was widespread and connected with a sub-theme of this frame, that Corbynism was a throwback to out-of-date ideas. These three frames, more and more, which I don't have time to go into, did not start in 2017. They did not appear in 2016. They were put in play 3 days, bears repeating, 3 days after Corbyn's election as leader of the Labour Party in September 2015. They're all there and more in Raphael Baer's article entitled "This Faragism of the Left Will Leave Behind a Loathing of All Politics" on Tuesday the 15th, September 2015. The frames were primed and ready, the target locked, the guns loaded. We should learn the lessons of history. Wherever the left rises, the Guardian will be an implacable enemy.
Thank you so much, Michael. As I mentioned right at the beginning, we're just going to have all the papers in order, and then we're going to have time for Q&A at the end of this session. So if you've got a question relating to Michael's paper, you can post it into a chat box right now. We'll try and address it after the chat. After the presentations are over. Can I remind you, if you're not a speaker, switch off your video. This is being recorded. So next up, we have a paper with 3 authors. There's Katy Brown, a final year PhD student at the University of Bath, whose research focuses on the mainstreaming of the far right in Europe. Her thesis aims to theorise mainstreaming and analyse the role of elite discourse in this process using the Brexit referendum as a case study. She's recently had articles published in Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power, and with Aurelien Mondron in Politics. Aurelien Mondron is the second author on this. He's a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Bath. He's the author of The Mainstreaming of the Extreme Right in France and Australia, a Populist Hegemony, and Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream. That was with Aaron Winter, who is the third author on this paper. Aaron Winter is a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of East London. He's co-editor of Reflexivity in Criminal Research and Historical Perspectives on Organised Crime and Terrorism, and co-author with Aurelien Mondron of Reactionary Democracy. I think, from what I understand, Aurelien is going to be giving this paper. I think the authors are in the audience. So if you've got any questions at the end, maybe they can also engage. And the title of their paper is The Guardian and Populist Hype. Over to you, Aurelien.
Thank you. So I hope you can hear me. I'm going to share my screen now. So you should be able to see the screen. So yeah, thank you so much for having us here. So I'll be presenting this paper for my 2 co-authors, Katy Brown and Aaron Winter. So The Guardian and Populist Hype is something that we've started working on a couple of years ago, looking at the way The Guardian is using the concept of populism to sometimes hide certain other issues or divert attention away from certain issues. And in particular, in this paper for the book on The Guardian, we were interested in looking at the way it actually euphemizes racism. So we are looking predominantly at the six months series that was called The New Populism, which was launched in November 2018. But actually, our corpus goes 6 months further to that. So it's a 1-year corpus in total that we're looking at. It is based on predominantly on Katy's innovative methodology. There's more in the chapter if you're interested to read more about the methodological side of it, or we can talk about it in the Q&A. Some of the articles that are part of this series, The New Populism, are based on solid academic research and or investigative journalism. So it's not to say that all the articles that were published in that series were terrible, but some of them were certainly very good. But there were also many that were particularly counterproductive. One of them was this article that was published on the first day to launch the series, Why is Populism Suddenly All the Rage? In 1998, about 300 Guardian articles mentioned populism. In 2016, 2000 did What Happened? And at no point during the series, the Guardian reflects on their ability to shape the agenda and on their ability to decide what goes on in the Guardian, actually, and what goes in the Guardian itself. And so that's what we're trying to kind of look at critically in a way. And here in this paper, what I want to look at fairly briefly is the way racism is euphemized in The Guardian. So what I'm going to start with first is populism, racism in inverted commas, and the process of euphemization. In our corpus, we see significant reluctance from The Guardian to call phenomena racist, frequently employing perspectivization strategies of distancing. Indeed, in 523 instances of racists, so racist, racism, racists, and so on, 235 or 45% of the references were either quoted, so in inverted commas, or formed part of reported speech. Someone said this person is racist, as opposed to this person is racist. Of the remaining examples, 157 were within opinion pieces or letters, leaving only 131, 25%, to occur in regular articles. A number of the strategies which are employed in this euphemization process are the following, and I'm just going to touch briefly on two of them. One of them is distancing. That's the one that I've mentioned already a couple of times, which is using racism in quotation marks, or as what someone else said. To give you an example, in an article on Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, here is a quote. Farage tweeted his support for Orban, who has been accused of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So instead of The Guardian saying tweeted his support for Orban, who is an Islamophobe and anti-Semite, he has been accused. So there's this distanciation here that The Guardian puts in place, even though it is very well proven and evidenced that Viktor Orban has been guilty of this kind of racism time and time again. The other one, which is very prevalent in terms of euphemization, strategy in terms of euphemization, is populism. Populism is often used as a term to replace more appropriate but also stigmatizing terms such as racism. Although the New Populism series attempts to address the issue of definitions, we see that this is often lost in the content of many articles. To give you again a couple of examples to illustrate this, in an article on Farage, the journalist asks, quote, "Is he Britain's greatest populist politician?" Which of course is a positive predication which encourages similar sentiment to be expressed in the response from the participant. Equally, it is stated, I quote, "I asked Peter Bone what populism means to him. Doesn't populist mean what most people want," he says, thereby again inviting involved actors to define the term for themselves, inevitably manipulating its meaning towards positive connotations and directly reinforcing, for example, in this case, the Brexit Party's claim to represent, I quote, "the People's Army," something that was pushed again in The Guardian on a number of occasions. You can see a few images here as well on my slides with, for example, the far-right AfD leader here who is called an anti-immigrant populist, even though he is one of the most far-right leaders of the AfD in Germany. And in fact, it is legal, according to a court proceeding, to call him a fascist. Instead, The Guardian decides to call him an anti-immigrant populist. You can see, of course, the space given to people who are trying to sanitize the far right, such as Matthew Goodwin here, and promoting his book on national populism, a concept that has been debunked and not used by anyone else but him in his work. And you can see, again, some more things from the United States there. So what you see is that racism is often euphemized, or attention is diverted away from the reach of racism, whether for fear of libel or being attacked in response, despite the very clear fact that journalists would be supported by many academic definitions far stronger on racism than on populism. So what we see really also in The Guardian, in the coverage of The Guardian when it comes to racism, is a clear separation between what we call illiberal racism or illiberal racisms and liberal racism or liberal racisms. Illiberal racism is most commonly denounced and serves to obscure the role played by more liberal articulations. The racism that is talked about, that is being articulated and amplified, is anathema to the paper's liberal identity and discourse. this is generally and traditionally blamed on some illiberal masses, whether it is the people, the white working class, the left behind, and so on, or on far-right so-called populists. It rests on the distinction between illiberal and liberal articulations of racism, and more precisely, the ways in which liberals deny their racism by displacing it onto more overt and unacceptable illiberal forms. Illiberal racism is what is commonly defined as real racism in hegemonic discourse. In the corpus, we see the use of racist as a descriptor free from quotation or reported speech, often in limited contexts, epitomizing such illiberal articulations, whether it is the South African apartheid, the rise of Hitler, blackface, Jobbik's discourse in Hungary, Trump's racist comments towards 4 congresswomen, racist chants in football stadium, etc. These are generally condemned and unequivocally. But there are some exceptions, of course, when, for example, historical icons and institutions are accused of illiberal racism, they are often excused as of their time. And of course, this was very obvious with the case of Winston Churchill. So this brings us to liberal racism, which includes those articulations of colorblind post-racial racism that distinguish themselves and deny being racist in contrast to illiberal forms. Liberal racism does not see itself or liberalism as being racist, instead evoking illiberal racism to justify its self-appointed non-racist position. In fact, it treats liberalism as the antidote or bulwark against racism. Yet at the same time, it weaponizes liberalism and liberal tropes such as freedom of speech, women's rights, and LGBTQ+ rights against racialized groups, something most notable in the case of Muslims. In doing so, it not only denies the racism often core to liberal practice, but justifies the lack of action on structural inequalities and continuity of less overt forms of systemic and coded racism. In fact, it often uses the threat of the far right to push moderate politicians and policies. For example, on the 22nd of November 2018, The Guardian published an interview with Hillary Clinton asserting that, I quote, and you can see it on the slide here, Europe must curb immigration to stop right-wing populists. Not only did the paper give a platform for this particular analysis legitimizing xenophobia, but this was the eye-catching headline in an already reactionary and racist political landscape. A day later, The Guardian published another article in which Clinton, this time, I quote, criticized the US media over its coverage of Donald Trump, calling on the press to get smarter about holding to account a president who is a master of diversion and distraction. The irony seemed totally lost on both The Guardian and Hillary Clinton, of course, who had bought into that diversion the day before. A few days later, left-wing columnist Paul Mason argued that liberals, I quote, liberals must learn the politics of emotion to beat right-wing populists, and that, again, quote, attachment to place and identity can be part of a radical democratic project that speaks to people's heart. Of course, that reminds us of the flyers in Hartlepool a couple of days ago with St. George's flag on it and the Labour logo. An implicit acknowledgement here was made of the need to engage with, not against, the racial, national, and even nativist politics of the right that the right have weaponized. Critically, liberal platforming and the push for moderate versions of far-right ideas, even if only to fend off a challenge, play a role in legitimizing and mainstreaming them. It became even more explicit when in September 2019, the former US ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, was interviewed and blamed the same refugees targeted by the far right and racists for the illiberal backlash against them. And I quote, the exodus of refugees has destabilized the region and Europe, prompting a racist backlash exploited by populist politicians. The topos of backlash here places refugees as the instigators and politicians, also note the use of populists here, of course, as only responding to the reaction prompted, thereby completely obscuring the power dynamics at play. With such arguments, the lines between illiberal and liberal articulations of racism become blurry and difficult to maintain. Despite this, The Guardian and other mainstream media partake in openly reinforcing these distinctions, which in turn legitimize the positions of those who attempt to straddle the mainstream-extreme divide. For instance, in December 2018, as Nigel Farage gained more mainstream legitimacy and the more illiberal far and extreme right exerted greater influence in UKIP, The Guardian columnist Martin Kettle urged readers to, I quote, look at the lurch to the racist right within UKIP, which has driven even Nigel Farage to resign from it. With this argument and the hyperbole of lurch to intensify the distinction, Kettle effectively affirmed Farage's own strategy to define himself as the more liberal, acceptable alternative to the old illiberal far or extreme right. It may seem to be a paradox or contradiction that liberals would platform and amplify the ideas of those they denounce and displace racism onto them. But it is this very process that is necessary for liberalism, centrism, and liberal racism to function and flourish. We can see how the two work together through the alignment of liberals, the establishment, and the far right around defending statues of slave traders and racists during the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. Which leads me to a couple more kind of concepts that we think are quite important in the legitimization of, or the euphemization, at least, of racism in The Guardian. Platforming, false equivalence, and free speech. Platforming, false equivalence, and free speech have proven increasingly problematic in giving disproportionate coverage to the far right and its ideas, portraying them as legitimate items of discussion, even if they are opposed editorially. The best example is probably the second day of the series on populism, which had no fewer than 4 articles on Bannon on this, portraying him as the key shaper of European politics, despite much evidence of his failure to do so. So we have 4 articles very prominent on the webpage of The Guardian here about Steve Bannon, who is setting the agenda, even though each of the articles are stating way below the headlines, but actually Steve Bannon is not a threat and his enterprise is already failing. And there's more detail in the article and chapter if you want. We also found particular issues with the way in which English Defence League founder Tommy Robinson, or Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, is framed. Concordance analysis revealed that activist was among the top 2 collocates, second to right of Tommy Robinson within the corpus, signifying a dominant mode of reference with euphemizing effects. Furthermore, in an article in which he is described as an anti-Islam campaigner, the reporters state that Robinson, I quote, frequently complains of being smeared as a racist, insisting he does not care about skin color, and that his objection is to Islamist political ideology rather than the people. The coverage of Tommy Robinson, and in particular his so-called activism, introduces a further key element to The Guardian's engagement with the other side through the construction of false equivalences, as if 2 sides must always be voiced in a polarized social and political landscape. The 2 sides may be Brexiteers versus Remainers, right and left, racist, anti-racist, and so on and so forth. In the context of the latter, Tommy Robinson is merely another activist in a democratic battle of ideas and beliefs, over ideas and beliefs, as opposed to targeting racialized people. This distinction feeds off both defenses of Islamophobia and an ideologically loaded free speech debate, which has been weaponized by reactionaries as a way of getting platforms and airing their ideas in the mainstream. There are also cases where problematic reactionary free speech narrative was reproduced. One of the examples we found was the paper's response to a letter condemning cancel culture, signed by major authors endorsing free speech, published in Harper's Magazines in August 2020. Instead of merely reporting on or challenging the letter's argument that free speech isn't a threat, The Guardian decided to present a debate between figures on both sides in the piece. Is free speech under threat from cancel culture? The decision to do so constructs a false equivalence and adopts the language and terms of a reactionary narrative in a media landscape already saturated by the reactionary view only served to legitimize it, and the right's attack on anti-racism and trans rights on yet another high-profile platform. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip to our conclusion. So it's not all bad, of course, and we don't want to argue that everything and all the journalism done in The Guardian is bad, but it's far from great. And you can see examples from last week that I've just added here very briefly, where there's a great long-read article on the invention of whiteness, but then there's also an article that says half of Brexit supporters were not left behind red wall voters. We knew that 5 years ago, but The Guardian is finally admitting to it after having legitimized the idea of the white working class and the left behind. So to conclude, what we argue is that in a context where the balance of good and bad opinions has become an apparent norm, the lack of a clear stand on issues such as racism and immigration risks creating some dangerous false equivalences and feeds into the mainstreaming of far-right ideas. As the reactionary hold on the political system tightens and much-needed media reform aimed at providing real democratic dissemination of information appears increasingly unlikely, news outlets like The Guardian have a crucial role to play. This rests on a choice between the kind of democracy it wishes to support, a reactionary democracy where racist, sexist, and transphobic and classist voices are afforded the same space as their opponents, or a democracy that does not tolerate that the humanity of some can be debated or treated as a matter of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aurelien, for that fascinating paper. Again, if you've got questions, please do leave them in the chat. We'll try and address them in the Q&A section at the end. Finally, we have our final paper is from Cinzia Padovani, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Radio, Television and Digital Media at Southern Illinois University. Her research interests focus on broadcasting history and policy, international communication and public service media. Her work has been published in journals including Javnos, The Public, Television and New Media, the International Journal of Communication, the Asian Journal of Communication, and the International Journal of Media and Cultural Politics. She is currently working on a book on contemporary ultra-right media and communication. The title of Cinzia's paper is Guardian's Coverage of the Ultra-Right. Cinzia, over to you.
Thank you so much. Let's see, I want to make sure that can you all see? Uh-oh.
Yep.
Can you see me?
Yep, we can see you, okay.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'm going to time myself. Okay, so thank you so much for this opportunity. First of all, here I will focus on the reasons why I use this term, the ultra-right. And of course, this is an analysis of the coverage of The Guardian, but then in a certain context. I want to also thank the Marie Curie fellowship, thanks to which, European fellowship, thanks to which I was able to do this work. So why, first of all, why use the term ultra-right? This is clearly on my part. I hope it becomes clear. Also an attempt to identify certain social actors, certain political actors who have been overall identified, as we just heard, as more far-right populists. But I want to focus the attention on actors whose ideologies are even closer to fascism or neo-fascism than to a less authoritarian right-wing populism. Sometimes when we pay so much attention to far-right populists, we might lose track of these other actors. I prefer the term ultra-right instead of extreme or far-right, which is these are the most used terms. Also because I want to avoid the trap of falling into this sense of balancing of extreme right, extreme left, far right, and far left. This has often been done by mainstream media commentators, but also in some of the scholarship. So I will now move into some of a review of the literature, and then we'll go into some of the main questions that inspired this work. So we have had a considerable body of literature in the field of political science, political philosophy, political history, devoted to this particular, to these neo-fascist or more fascist ultra-right actors. In the British context, for instance, I want to draw your attention to the work of John Richardson, for instance, who has written extensively on British fascism, and then the work of Hilary Pilkington on the English Defence League, and Nigel Copsey on the British National Party. There is, however, scarcity of studies focused on how mainstream media have represented ultra-right organizations, ultra-right actors, and so I want to call your attention to the work of Barca Merce in this sense, who has done a lot of normative work and trying to highlight how important it is for mainstream media, in this particular case, at least in his work, to give less attention to these actors. And we can discuss later on you know, what we think about that particular normative stance. So my research wants to investigate longitudinally the discourse related to the ultra-right, and of course by The Guardian, and of course this in some ways can parallel or overlap some of the questions and the research that was highlighted by my colleagues in this same panel. I should also say that this is a work in progress, and this is part of a larger study on ultra-right and mainstream media representation. So some of the main questions that animate my research have been this. So, you know, what are the characteristics of The Guardian's coverage? Also in comparison, compared to other British newspapers, and in particular here I will introduce the Daily Mail and the Telegraph. Also, I'm interested in looking at how The Guardian's coverage might parallel or might compare to coverage of ultra-right organizations on comparable newspapers in Italy. For instance, we will go into this comparative framework between Italy and the UK. Italy is just the other country that I've been studying. And then something that I'm very interested in is how have opposition movements been represented vis-a-vis the ultra-right. My previous colleague was mentioning that indeed that there seems to be these oppositional frames, right, in which there is an emphasis on these opposites. We will go into that. Of course, here I'm talking about anti-fascist organizations, anti-fascist movements, and also anti-racist movements as well. The methodology for this study is a methodology based on a two-pronged approach. First of all, is a content analysis to give us a sense of the contours of coverage, look at trends, words count, location of the articles. And then the second prong is a more in-depth reading of headlines and also selected samples of news items. The time frame for this research, as I said, is I want to look at coverage systematically and methodically over a 10 years time frame. The reason for this time frame is simple in many regards. I began my Marie Curie fellowship in 2019 or early 2020, and I was very and so I wanted to look at coverage from the earlier decade, and the database is Nexus UK. So first of all, let's look at the content analysis and see a little bit about how The Guardian compares to other newspapers when it comes to the representation of some of the actors that could be defined as ultra-right actors. So this is a very basic count of number of occurrences of key terms, and we can go through the key terms if you want during questions and answers. I don't have time now, but looking at Britain First, the first line here, the British National Party, the English Defence League, and the National Front. So we see here The Guardian, the Mail, and the Telegraph. So what is clear and evident here is that a left-leaning newspaper is the one that more than anybody else is paying attention to these actors. And indeed, historically, The Guardian has dedicated more attention to the alt-right than any other newspaper, that is certainly the Telegraph and the Daily Mail. We have seen this not just with the British National Party or the other parties that I mentioned in the previous table, but also, for instance, when it comes to social media personalities that we could consider part of the alt-right, like, for instance, Tommy Robinson, or others, Katy Hopkins, or any actors where that we tested received much more attention by the Guardian than by any of the other newspapers. For instance, the Guardian has published more than 3 times as many articles on the British National Party as the Telegraph, and 6 times more the amount by the Daily Mail. Not only this, the words count also tell us that the Guardian has given much more space to the British National Party in this particular case, as compared to the Telegraph and as compared to the Daily Mail. Also, it gives more space, more space, but also a more prominent position, more central position. So here we see the long, the 10 years. Here, the British National Party in the 10 years preceding, so from 2009 to 2008. Of course, at this point, the British National Party, already by the 2009, was a very important part indeed. In 2009 was getting a lot of attention because of 2 major reasons. One were the elections, I think May elections, in which the BNP did very well, pretty well, and also because in October of that year, Nick Griffin, the leader of the British National Party, was invited as to the BBC Panorama and newscast, and that really was what drew a lot of criticism and a lot of attention. After the 2009, the next peak would be in 2014, when the British National Party and its leadership were really going through a lot of scandals, which eventually also led to its demise. What we see here is once again that the Guardian really pays a lot of attention to this actor. This is another example here for you to see that the English Defence League are basically similar. I mean, the comparison is similar. What is also interesting that I found is that the Guardian always is the first one to give attention to any of these ultra-right actors, first and foremost, compared to others. We already talked about the peaks of coverage, for instance, with regard to the British National Party in 2009 and 2014. And we also mentioned that the Guardian has consistently been the first to report on ultra-right actors. So we can now move into the more in-depth reading. And I have very few minutes, so I'm going to go fast. A preliminary analysis, as I mentioned to you, this is a work in progress, reveals that on one side that there is an expected harsh condemnation of the BNP, Nick Griffin, or any of these actors, but on the other, there seems to be, at least in the sample, a lack of a sense of solution, antidotes to the rise of the ultra-right, or to the presence or visibility of the ultra-right. What I find to be very interesting is that the BNP, for instance, is consistently portrayed as an aberration, as a foreign body within the British politics, and there seems to be not much attention to the fact that these actors express ideologies that are very that run deep in some sectors of the British society and also in some of its institutions. And I'm thinking, for instance, here about the various immigration laws and the Home Office, and this is what I think is also missing from the coverage. Some critique and some good practices. Good practice, rare use of quotations, a very distinct effort never to provide a platform for these actors to actually speak their voice. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, scarce attention to anti-racist, anti-fascist movements and actors within, at least within, the same news items. The international comparison, very briefly, is, of course, between Britain and Italy, very, different countries, different political histories, political electoral systems, different experiences of fascism, but with a similar, although loosely comparable, colonial past or colonial mentality put in place in both places. Would be very interesting to me to also study how anti-racist and anti-fascist activists work in the two countries and how the media report on them. The Italian press here, very quickly, Corriere and La Repubblica. Corriere is a center of right, most important newspaper in Italy. La Repubblica, the second most read, and center left. So probably more similar to The Guardian. The opposite extremisms thesis and the oppositional frame that we mentioned before is very much present in the Italian press. The voice is, especially Corriere della Sera, gives a lot of voice to these actors. And also we see that Corriere covers these actors more than any other newspapers. So to summarize, I think it would be very interesting to think about why, for instance, newspapers like the Daily Mail or the Telegraph do not give much attention to the alt-right. Clearly, that is not to give them the oxygen of publicity. So I would really want to think about this also because internationally, in the international comparison, we see that is slightly different. In Italy, a more center of right newspaper pays more attention or seems to pay more attention to the ultra-right. Recommendations, if I were to give any recommendations to practitioners, I would say more attention to anti-fascist and anti-racist movements and actors, and less oppositional framing in which we balance the center-right and the center-left. I would be grateful for any intervention or any question. As I said, that this is a work in progress. This is my bibliography, and this is some of my references here, or ways in which you can get in touch with me. Thank you very much. Sorry, I took longer.
No, absolutely fine. We should have time, a good amount of time for questions. Thank you so much for that fascinating paper, Cinzia. So you can leave questions in the chat box. We've got a few, which I'm going to address now, but you can also raise your hand. Thanks. Good to see you all speakers. Thank you again for all your papers. There's a question here from A. Riggs, which was for Michael, which I think you might have addressed in the chat, but Michael, I'll give you an opportunity to address it. But A. Riggs asks, isn't it true that Brits living abroad did not have the right to vote in the referendum? And there's a link there to a Guardian article on this topic. Yeah, Michael, is there anything you want to elaborate on there?
I mean, I have answered it in the chat. Yeah, I mean, I think if we did delegitimize every vote because some group was excluded, then very few votes, most votes in America in the 20th century, for a start, very few Democrat elections would meet the test. So it was a very imperfect referendum in the sense that the debate was appalling, really narrowly conceived. It was largely conducted between protagonists of the Conservative Party Remainers and Leavers within the Conservative Party. So, you know, I'm not at all suggesting it was great and wonderful, but I think it's a stretch to say that the vote was not democratic. I think that's a kind of narrative, which I think what's happening there is that people don't really want to acknowledge or engage with what was happening with people's sentiments and feelings on the ground.
Thank you, Michael. Got a question here from my colleague Natalie Fenton for Aurelien and his authors. I wonder whether the political economy of news production, the speed it has to be produced, and the space it now needs to fill with ever fewer journalists, plays its part in capturing MSM mainstream journalism into the reactionary democracy you described so well. Can they ever be truly democratic if they don't break free of the current economic model that they work within?
Yeah, I think Natalie, that's a great question. I think I totally agree, and I would expect my two co-authors to agree on this. And I think the point of our work on The Guardian is really not to blame journalists as individuals in a way. I mean, there's terrible practice by individual journalists, but it's not to kind of say that all journalism is terrible. There's some really, really good journalism in The Guardian, in other platforms, and obviously the pressures that journalists are under forces them to make these kind of mistakes. But I mean, just to give you a little bit of context of what really like hit us when we kind of looked at actually the data we gathered on The Guardian and the new populism series, we had about 1,500 articles, I think, and during that year, where The Guardian dedicated huge amounts of resources, right, to kind of like fancy kind of, as you could see on the slides, and I'm sure you've seen them in The Guardian, you know, they had like a quiz, how populist are you, like fancy designs, like looking really cool and so on. So quite a lot of resources, not just in making it look good, but also in defining populism, hiring some quite prominent academics to kind of define it. We had 1,500 articles in total. 1,000 of these 1,500 articles used populism only once in the article. 11 of them used populism only in the headline. Quite often we saw populism being used completely randomly to talk about Sweetheart Alabama, for example, to talk about one jazz musician was called I can't remember what it is. Katy might remember, but so it's. I think you're right. I think we just need to break away from that system, and I think with these pressures, they had to kind of keep a fervent jazz populist. Katy put in the, yeah, that's right, a fervent jazz populist. Someone was called. I mean, it makes no sense. And I think what we found very, very problematic about it is that it ended up actually destroying the hard work they'd done. It ended up destroying the work that academics had done, that the serious journalists had done, and it ended up legitimizing. You know, if you talk about fervent jazz populist and then you call Nigel Farage a populist as well, then nothing matters anymore. Anyone can be a populist, and calling Farage a populist doesn't matter. And I think one of the things that really got to us is the lack of reflection. And, you know, the headline that I showed, that first article that was published, "Why is populism all the rage?" And The Guardian never thinking maybe we're responsible for it at least a little bit is quite incredible to me. And I think it goes beyond just even the economy of it. I think it goes towards the way journalists look at themselves, and the media looks at itself as well, which I think is not just an economic problem in a way. I think it needs far more reflexivity and accountability, I think, and it's a problem that's wider and about our democracies, really.
Aurelien, just while you're here, A-Riggs, you've kind of alluded to this a bit actually, but A-Riggs would like to hear more about your methodology. You mentioned the number of articles you looked at, but could you elaborate some more on?
Could we actually unmute Katy, because she might be able to say it much more clearly and precisely than I can.
Great.
Here she is.
Hi, Katy. You are on mute still. Force me. Can I?
No, I think, yeah.
I'm not sure if I have. Oh, there you are, Katy.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Aurelien, for presenting it, and thank you for the question, because I enjoy talking about methodology, so I was happy to see that. Yeah, so the methodology that we're using is a combination between three traditions within discourse analysis, so discourse theory, critical discourse studies, and corpus linguistics. You usually use the tree to visualize it, but you sort of have discourse theory as the roots of the methodology. So with the post-structuralist position and the way that it conceptualizes logics of discourse. That forms like the philosophical foundations of the methodology. And then you've got critical discourse studies as the trunk of the tree, because it kind of links this theory to analysis. So through more concrete examples and in-depth analysis of texts. And then at the top, the branches, there's corpus linguistics. So that allows computerized analysis, so you can work on like a broader scale and look at certain words in more depth. So the idea of that combination of methodologies is that you can deal with broader questions, but also look at it and look at that through wider analysis of lots of data, but then also probe certain aspects in a lot greater detail through close textual analysis. So that's the methodology that we've used to look at these populism, the new populism series. So yeah. But if anyone has any other questions on that, feel free to send an email or whatever, because as I say, I enjoy talking about it.
Always got room for methodology chat conferences like this. Thank you, Katy, for that response. I've got a question here from Nico. He says, I'm worried that there is a tendency in Aurelien, Mondron and his co-authors and Cinzia talks to see things without out-of-date frames, to use Michael Wayne's term, and not to interrogate what is really going on. This is also true of a lot of political commentary in The Guardian, which starts from disliking views and people. Isn't the liberal approach to be open-minded, inquiring, and to try to understand? Cinzia, could you maybe respond to that first? Oh, you're mute. You're mute. Oh.
Sorry. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so it's in the chat there as well, if you want to see it. But Nico asks, he's worried that there's a tendency in your and Aurelien's papers to see things within out-of-date frames and not to interrogate what is really going on. This is also true of a lot of political commentary in The Guardian, which starts from disliking views and people. Isn't it a liberal approach to be open-minded, inquiring, to try to understand?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, well, I think that's why it's also very important to, to really refine the definition of what we are looking at, and including this simple definition. I mean, these definitions of these big categories of far-right populism or populism in general. So there is a tendency. Hold on, I want to see more. But this is not what the question is about. The question is about, is there a tendency to use out-of-date frames? Okay, so the out-of-date frames would be the neo-fascism and anti-fascism. This would be a question that I will have for the person for Nico. Is that what is out of date? And would this be also a problem for political commentary and trying to understand? Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately, some of these actors are not outdated at all, and actually they are updating themselves in so many ways. They are becoming more and more relevant. They are able, just to go with the comment and the answer, one of the methodology of critical discourse analysis, they are able to utilize maybe outdated frames, if we want to call them frames, but outdated terminologies or contexts, and repurpose them into more contemporary terms. So I think it's important to locate these actors according to also an ideological belonging, to their ideological roots. I don't want to say that we are going back to fascism, or that we are going back to the neo-fascism of the 1970s, here in Italy at least. But those connections, those roots, are still present in a lot of the language, and most important, in a lot of the political praxis that these actors put into place. So how are journalists and commentators going to try to understand these actors? I think that's a very valid question, but I don't know if they are outdated. I wish they were.
Aurelien, before I invite you to speak, I think Nico's there and he suggested he could follow up. Can we unpause Nico?
I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anamik. Yeah, I think there's a basic frame of left and right, which I think has not been useful for 20 years or more, and really since the end of the Cold War. And there's another frame of liberal versus illiberal, right, populist, or whatever. And I think, as people interested in media and journalists should be interested in really trying to understand what's going on. I think Michael's touched on this. There is something changing in the UK in the last 10, 20 years or so, which is related to the end of left and right. And we should be supporting any journalist, or, I think Matthew Goodwin's been introduced, to be honest. I think it was Aurelien who said that. And Matthew Goodwin is a very thorough and sincere academic. You can disagree with him, you can challenge his methodology or his data, but the idea of populism is an idea which has been itself traduced, and it has a rich history. In the late 19th century in the United States, people, the Guardian would have probably supported it, and now it's just been traduced as it's Trumpism, it's people being xenophobic and so on. And I just think these categories don't really work. Even the categories of race. I mean, you could actually make a case, as Kenan Malik has in The Guardian, that racial thinking is being applied to the plebeians in Britain who vote the wrong way, who have the wrong attitudes, who are not modern culturally. And in a way, you could argue that liberals have adopted racial thinking. I mean, you could even argue it around BLM, to be honest, that it's not the content of your character anymore, but your skin color, which qualifies you to comment on things and to have to have your own truth. So I think these categories are very mixed up, and if we don't inquire, we really will miss what's going on.
But I think the whole point is that, and I mean, I just find it quite ironic to say in the same sentence that Matthew Goodwin is really right to talk about populism because populism has a long history. The point is Matthew Goodwin hasn't studied that history, and Matthew Goodwin doesn't understand or cares to understand what populism is or the history of populism. His point is actually to push far-right ideas. What he calls populism is not populism by any definition, whether it's Gazmodis, whether it's Hofstadters, whether it's more recent ones and critical ones. The point is that's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to push ideas that are very much linked to the far right. And look at his bedfellows. Just like we are pushing ideas that are left-wing, and we're still academics. I'm not criticizing his academic credentials. That's besides the point, although his data has been debunked by people who are much more qualified than I am. What I find quite interesting in your point about our frames being out of date is the whole point of our work with Katy, but particularly with Aaron in reactionary democracy, is to look at these frames and to challenge them, to update them, and to show things that are pretty obvious as well. Is the fact that in your question, that this assumption that liberalism is a frame that is not out of date, but the end of history has been debunked for a long, long time now, and the far right is coming back under new guises, as Cinzia said quite clearly. But what we're saying is not that the far right that's coming back is the same as the one with swastikas, jackboots, and things like that. It's a different form, but it's an updated form. But at the same time, I think we have to see the way these things evolve. And I find it fascinating where you say, well, the left, the right is outdated, these are outdated frames. But populism, we need to think about populism, as like something that is 150 years old. And it's like, well, it seems quite contradictory and maybe fitting your ideas or your agenda. I don't know. But you can't see both. The thing is, I think the history of this concept has to be seen quite thoroughly. And I think, the concept of race is incredibly important at the moment. And I don't think we should euphemize it and say that actually it's being overused and so on. I think these are slippery slopes, and these are the slippery slopes that people like, whom we call reactionary legitimizer with Aaron, are sending us down. And I think the Guardian has to be far more clever not to fall for these kind of arguments, because these are dangerous arguments, I would say.
Cinzia, would you like to respond?
I also wanted to follow up, Nico, because you mentioned something about the left and racism being, if I understood you correctly, being also having been part of certain left. So my reference, for instance, to the Home Office and to Labour, that has not been able since the 1960s to put in place immigration reforms and immigration laws that were less racist than the ones that we have in the UK. And I am talking also, we have a different left in Italy, but let us also say that there is not much of a left, including here in Italy, and that immigration immigration laws that are an expression of certain racism and colonial past remain and are not being challenged by the left, including by the so-called left or liberal media. I think that there needs to be some serious opposition, including some serious media and journalism work that challenges a lot of this, including the racism that is part and parcel also of certain left, because absolutely racism is not a prerogative of the right.
Thank you for that really interesting exchange. I've got a question for Michael, if it's okay, chair's privilege and all that. I was just kind of interested, in adopting Gramscian terms, about contradiction within your analysis. You've identified those three frames, very persuasive as well. But I just wanted to know whether you encountered, the pro-Corbyn sentiments within Guardian's coverage. And then also there's a question of the fact that the Guardian, in kind of pushing that particular, it's not to be strong a word, agenda, would have alienated a lot of its readership as well. So it was kind of, there was a bit of a risk as well. Or am I being too generous here? Did you see that an ideological closure around the coverage around Corbyn, or did you see alternative discourses, albeit ones that were being drowned out?
I didn't conduct a big data analysis, so we're talking a small sample, and we're talking also a kind of impression. I read the Guardian every day. I was reading it all through this. It's funny, I read the Guardian every day. I hate the bloody thing, but I think that there was a period after 2017 when, before 2017, the Guardian was attacking Corbyn quite consistently. I vividly remember immediately after his election that there did seem to be a big gulf between the Guardian's editorials and below the line comments. This is not scientific, obviously, but the impression that you got was that the below the line comments were really critical of the Guardian's editorial line and all the attacks on Corbyn. And that disappeared by the time you got to 2018, 2019. The below the line comments was very hostile to Corbyn. So I think a space did open up initially. I think the Guardian's readership a section of the Guardian's readership were. Of course, it's not scientific, it's very impressionistic. Let's remember that, the Guardian's class base of the readership, 85% is ABC1s. That's very, very tilted towards the upper middle classes. So, but I think a significant well, a part of their readership was pro-Corbyn, and it was a risk. I mean, you know, most of the Labour Party people who vote for Labour read The Guardian, so they would have been reading The Guardian. They would have been upset, those members, those voters. They wouldn't have liked it. I think that The Guardian won them round, not The Guardian on its own, but I think The Guardian played an important role in amplifying the strategies that were there to drive this wedge between Corbyn and his supporters. I think, you know, you just get the impression when you look below the line later on, the hostility was ferocious. There were very few voices supporting Corbyn towards the end, below the line, as there were, you know, in the general media space. I think The Guardian did a very effective job in. I was in Brighton shortly afterwards, and I was giving a talk at a university, and I was surrounded by Labour Party members, and you know, they thought he was stupid as well. They thought he was like Linda D66. It was vitriolic, and yeah, I think The Guardian played a big significant part in that. Not decisive, because it didn't make the strategies up, it amplified them.
Thank you so much, Michael. Really interesting. I think we've got time for one more question. Maybe if you want to squeeze one in, just chuck it in the chat box. But this is from Becky Gardner, who says, excellent papers. Thank you all. Becky's question is, how would the panelists like to see the Guardian report and comment on someone like Farage? And Becky asked this because as she says, when I worked there were internal debates about this. The dilemma was seen as not wanting to amplify far-right views or give them a platform on the one hand, but wanting to explore and take seriously UKIP's popularity on the other. Now, Cinzia, you kind of did touch on this at the end of the paper, so maybe you might want to elaborate on that before I then go over to Aurelien and Michael.
Thank you. This is a very important question, and of course, these are dilemmas that professional journalists I know and editors always have to face. Part of my work, some work that I did not go into this time, has been to interview journalists here in Italy, and now I'm starting to interview journalists in the UK. Similar to this question would be the question, what do we do with Matteo Salvini? I don't know if you know a little bit of Italian politics, but Matteo Salvini, leader of a far-right populist party, who is very high in the polls. How do you deal with that? Well, I have some thoughts. One is try not to focus on issues that these parties own, because it has been shown in the scholarship, and journalists know this, they sense this, that the more you play in their box and you cover, you include that one. You talk about immigration in a certain way, then of course you play into their hands. I would say also, if there is any organization or activism against Farage or against what he represents, then always include it in any piece, avoiding those, though, the oppositional frame, weighing as if they were two sides of the same coin. And then I would say with somebody like Farage or Matteo Salvini here or Giorgia Meloni here, that's almost impossible. But really watch to the use of quotation marks. But these journalists know this very well. But of course, how do you do that when you have Giorgia Meloni, leader of Fratelli d'Italia, basically a neo-fascist party that is now, 15-17% in the polls in Italy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cinzia. And Michael or Aurelien, would you like to respond?
Who first?
Well, Michael, you.
Yeah, I mean, it is a legitimate dilemma. I mean, you certainly don't want to go down the road of the BBC, which, you know, for a period of many years had Farage on a very regular basis on its premier political debate programme, Question Time. If this guy's so individually popular, how come he never won a seat in the House of Commons? But he represented ideas that were achieving some kind of purchase. I mean, the word popular is a difficult one to use, but it's clearly he was representative of something. I mean, I don't think liberalism, I don't think the Guardian could do it, because I think it would require the Guardian to uncouple itself, to transform itself after 200 years away from liberalism. I don't think liberalism can really address Farage, because liberalism, especially in its current configuration, I mean, there was a period when liberalism was a bit more bolder, where it was in an alliance with the Labour movement, but in its, you know, post-social democratic period, which we're now in, liberalism cannot engage with the political economy of capitalism. And it's not rocket science. You know, if you make people's lives miserably insecure and hard and tough, then, you know, liberalism's idea that people are going to be, you know, inclusive, and they're going to feel happy about, you know, sharing their space, their place with people who can be easily framed as remote and distant and other. I mean, that's bonkers. You know, you have to go to the political economy, because that is where the conditions for the far right rise. And we know this. I mean, we know this. The history shows us again and again the far right rise when there is deepening social and economic inequality. Can the Guardian really acknowledge that? It would have to unravel itself, I think.
Thank you, Michael. Aurelien, I'm so sorry, we run out of time. So can you give your response in like a minute, less than?
Yeah, I mean, you know, like, fine, cover the far right. We need to don't do it disproportionately. Don't hype it. Talk about others. Talk about abstention. Don't fall for the talking points of the far right. Don't fall for the idea that the far right represents the left behind. This is rubbish. I'm sorry, by any means. Like, the far right does not represent the white working class. Does not represent the left behind. It represents a tiny minority. And actually, let's focus on the majority. And the fact that the left, the Guardian, the centre left are falling for that is shocking. I mean, if you want to speak for the voiceless, don't speak for the voiceless that's racist. Speak for the voiceless that is not racist, and they're far more, and they need far more attention. But I agree with Mike. I doubt that the Guardian will do that, because I think, you know, the Guardian actually quite likes having the far right, because that, you know, acts as a diversion away from the fact that the Guardian plays a role in perpetuating systems of oppression and capitalism and so on. And, you know, they use libertarians on the side as well to do the same thing, you know, and creating these false debates where the alternative is between the liberalism of the Guardian and the far right, the libertarians. None of them offer any kind of solutions except racism, exclusion, and so on and so forth. And certainly none of them are fighting for the working class, the poor, the voiceless, or any of that. So yeah, just, you know, take responsibility, do it seriously, cover them, but cover them properly. But I'm not holding my breath.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Really interesting responses. And Becky, who asked the question, agreed. So thank you very much to all of our speakers for giving such brilliant and interesting papers. Thank you to our audience, those of you who posed questions. And I just want to remind you, we've got the keynote at 4:30 today. That's Ghada Kami giving their paper, Reporting the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, The Guardian's Fatal Ambivalence. Great. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Enjoy the rest of the day. Hope you get out and enjoy the sun at some point. And see you again soon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Yes, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.